This hearing of the Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, Refugees, Border Security, and International Law will come to order. We realize that there is great interest in the plight of migrant farm workers in America, but we will ask that the press actually pull back from the table so that we can observe all four of our witnesses. And if the press cannot do so, they'll be asked to leave the room. I would like to welcome our witnesses, members of the Immigration Subcommittee, and others who've joined us today for the Subcommittee's hearing on protecting America's harvest. The American agricultural sector has long suffered from a lack of available U.S. workers to grow and pick America's fruits and vegetables. Even in today's tough economic climate, whether we like it or not, an insufficient and continually decreasing number of U.S. workers are willing to fill manual agricultural jobs. America's farms are dependent on a reliable workforce to produce our domestic food supply, and today's farms are struggling to stay in business as a result of current labor challenges. Today's hearing will explore the labor needs of our nation's agricultural sector, its attempt to recruit U.S. workers for agricultural labor, the problems with our current visa program for agricultural workers, and potential solutions. One explanation for why American workers may now be unwilling to engage in manual farm worker when they were willing to do so decades ago may lie in our improving educational system. In the 1940s and 50s, a full half of the native-born workforce did not have a high school diploma. Last year, that number was 5.7%. In any event, the difficulty in recruiting native-born workers to work on farms has been highlighted by the United Farm Workers Take Our Jobs, Please campaign. The campaign invites unemployed Americans to use the UFW's assistance to obtain employment as farm workers. Yet, according to the UFW, even in a period of high unemployment across all educational and socioeconomic sectors of our society, only 7 U.S. workers have agreed to actually work in the fields as of today. I have been a long-time advocate for farm workers and growers. When I was on the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors in the 1980s, I worked closely with the United Farm Workers and the Farm Bureau. I've spent time on many farms. Just recently, at the invitation of the UFW, I spent the day picking strawberries at a farm near my district. The UFW also invited me to spend the day picking vegetables in a farm in New York with Stephen Colbert. I want to thank UFW's President Arturo Rodriguez for bringing us together on this important issue. And I would like to admonish the audience, before I continue my statement, that we need to maintain order and decorum throughout these proceedings, and to that end, I would like to remind all of the visitors in the audience that they should refrain from any manifestation of approval or disapproval of these proceedings or any other disruptive actions. If necessary, the Capitol Police are here to remove anyone who disrupts the hearing, but we certainly hope that won't be necessary. Part of what I've learned over the years is that without a sufficient U.S. labor force, U.S. farmers have increasingly relied on undocumented workers. According to the Department of Labor, over 50% of all seasonal agricultural workers are undocumented. Experts believe that due to underreporting, that number may actually be closer to 75%. Critics argue that the shortage of U.S. agricultural workers could be solved by simply increasing wages and working conditions. As a longtime and ardent supporter of farm workers, I would like nothing better. But we must also face the reality that the nation's growers compete with farmers from around the world in this increasingly globalized world. Increasing wages and benefits in an amount necessary to attract millions of educated U.S. workers to the fields would mean increased production costs that could render U.S. food products uncompetitive with imported products. American farms would then close, in turn resulting in the mass offshoring of tens of millions of agriculture and related jobs. Indeed, this is already happening. Between 2007 and 2008, 1.56 million acres of U.S. farmland were shut down. Many of these farms simply moved to Mexico, where agricultural labor is more available. And when farms close, our country suffers. Not only do we lose the jobs filled by those who work in the fields, but we lose the millions of so-called upstream and downstream jobs connected to those jobs. Whether it's processing, packaging, transportation, seed production, manufacturing, accounting, advertising, these jobs are overwhelmingly filled by U.S. workers. Yet these jobs disappear too when farms are closed. Economists believe that for every farm job lost, the U.S. loses another 3.1 complementary jobs. Aside from the loss of millions of jobs, the closure of American farms endangers the nation's economy and national security. The truth is that our national security depends on our ability to produce a stable domestic food supply. Like oil, the more we rely on other countries for our food supply, the more we fall victim to an increased trade debt, scarcity in times of drought, fluctuating external market prices, and political pressure. We would also increase the possibility of foodborne illnesses and terrorist attacks through our nation's food supply. The plain truth is that food security is national security. America cannot afford to stop producing its own food supply, and we need the labor force to do so. Today, we will hear from our panel of witnesses to better understand this complex and very important issue for Americans, American jobs, our economy, and our national security. People in the media spotlight have a special ability to focus public opinion on an issue. Whether it's Bono talking about third world poverty or Angelina Jolie advocating for protecting children against human trafficking, the power of media figures to use their celebrity to focus attention on essential public issues is well known and well regarded. I'm happy that Stephen Colbert of the Colbert Report has joined that group of celebrities who will use their media position to benefit others. As you can see from Mr. Colbert's written testimony, he has taken the time to walk in the shoes of migrant farm workers, and he urges reform of our immigration laws. I'm happy that the United Farm Workers helped introduce me to Mr. Colbert, who I had not met before, so we could spend a day on a farm together. His actions are a good example of how, using both levity and fame, a media figure can bring attention to a critically important issue for the good of the nation. I appreciate all of our witnesses' efforts to be with us today and their leadership in this area, and I hope that together we can find solutions to these pressing problems. I would now recognize our distinguished ranking member, Steve King, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate being recognized, and the thought that comes to mind as I listen to your opening statement is I'm wondering how the Eskimos got along all those centuries without fresh fruit and vegetables if it's a national security issue. However, before we start the testimony from the panel, I'd like to focus my remarks on protecting American workers. Illegal immigration, the lack of enforcement of our immigration laws, and today's jobs depression have formed a perfect storm for hurting Americans. The most important duty of the subcommittee is that we ensure our nation's immigration policy lifts up Americans, not holds them down. I find it hard to understand why some people carelessly claim that Americans won't do hard work. I find this claim insulting, as I am sure most hardworking Americans do. It's most insulting to those brave American soldiers who voluntarily risk their lives to defend our freedom and way of life every day, the men and women that take on terrorists in Iraq and Afghanistan, trek for miles across the desert with 70 or more pounds of gear and 100+ degree temperatures for about $8.09 an hour. And that includes the Marines. Maybe we should be spending less time watching Comedy Central and more time considering all the real jobs that are out there, ones that require real hard labor and don't involve sitting behind a desk. If we did, we'd realize that every day American workers perform the dirtiest, most difficult, most dangerous jobs that can be thrown at them. From crab fishermen that venture out into some of the roughest and most dangerous waters in the world, to the Joe the Plumbers of the world, who many days would prefer the aroma of fresh dirt to that of the sewage from American elitists who disparage them even as they flush. These are real Americans doing real jobs, tasks that simply must get done. When American workers are treated with respect and paid for the labor, they will do any job and they'll outwork anyone on earth. America's spirit is hardworking, and so are the people that comprise this great nation. Let's move on to agriculture. I represent a rural district made up mostly of farmers and farm communities, and the people of Iowa know what it takes to manage and effectively run a farm. One issue with attracting more American workers to seasonal agricultural labor is that most migrant workers are consigned to perpetual poverty. I wish that the United Farm Workers Union today understood, as Cesar Chavez clearly did, the devastating impact that illegal immigration has on American farm workers. Of course, it is argued by Tom Vilsack, President Obama's Secretary of Agriculture, that food prices would be 3, 4, or 5 times more if it were not for illegal immigrant workers. This is blatantly false and can't be supported by any data, and he doesn't even bother to defend himself. Data from the Secretary's own Department of Agriculture and the Bureau of Labor Statistics show that labor costs only represent 6% of the price consumers pay for fresh fruits and vegetables. You could double the pay of workers and see only a 6% increase in consumer prices. Highly respected agricultural economist Philip Martin of the University of California notes that if there was a 40% increase in farm wages, the average household would spend only $8 more a year on fruits and vegetables, less than the price of a movie ticket. I'm sure that most Americans would gladly pay $8 more a year in order to ensure a legal workforce. Cheap labor is just not worth illegal immigration's cost to Americans as workers or as taxpayers. The reality is, employers hire desperate aliens who will work for much less than Americans, driving wages down and making it impossible for American workers to compete. As Ranking Member Smith has pointed out many times in the past, there are 8 million illegal immigrants in the workforce competing against the 15.4 million Americans who are officially counted as unemployed, which includes the 80 million who are simply not in the workforce because they've dropped out and are no longer looking for jobs, and they are of working age. Americans have given up looking for those jobs because wages have been depressed and job opportunities eliminated by low-skilled and very mobile immigration. The percent of teenagers who work has never been lower. Professor Carol Swain will testify today about the toll mass immigration has taken on minority communities. What's important to point out is that all of this started happening well before the recession. Professor George Borjas, now at Harvard University, did groundbreaking research on the impact of immigration in the 1980s and 90s on low-skilled American workers. Professors Andrew Sum and Paul Harrington and other researchers at the Center for Labor Market Studies at Northeastern University found in 2005 that, given, and I quote, given large job losses among the nation's teens, 20 to 24-year-olds with no four-year degree, black males, and poorly educated native-born men, it is clear that native-born workers have been displaced in recent years because of immigration, close quote. It's amazing to me that amnesty advocates simply ignore the 80 million labor pool. We can either feed, clothe, and house them, or put them to work to feed and clothe the world. The current economic crisis only magnifies the impact on American workers and families, but unless our immigration policies are changed, American workers and families will continue to be undermined even after the economy turns the corner. The Heritage Foundation found that the average household headed by an immigrant household and without a high school degree receives over $19,000 in total government benefits more than they pay in taxes from federal, state, and local. Cheap labor? You know, I think about the day that I had to swim out into a sewer lagoon and dive into 9 feet of fluid to retrieve a pump. And when I think about the day that it was 20 below and I'm in the water fixing a water line, and the warmest place there was in the water. The work that I've done in my life in the construction business and the work that we've put our workers through and the pride with which they take, it means that it's an insult to me to hear that Americans won't do this work. I can't think of a job that I have not been willing to do, and I can't think of an employee that I've had over the 28 years in the construction business that refused to do the work that was necessary. Americans will do that work, but they want to be paid a respectable wage for it. I look forward to the testimony, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and with the agreement of the minority, we are recognizing the author of the Ag Jobs Bill, Mr. Berman, for a statement, and then Mr. Smith and Mr. Conyers will give their opening statements. Mr. Berman.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for holding a hearing which, perhaps like few others, will highlight the conditions of migrant farm workers in this country and turn attention to this critical issue. I thank both the chair and ranking member of the full committee for allowing to go. This is an issue that I have been focused on for 40 years, and in the last 10 years have each session introduced bipartisan legislation to try and deal with this issue, known as ag jobs. Unfortunately, because I chair another committee, I have a hearing at 10 o'clock, and so I appreciate the courtesies extended to let me jump in line here. I'm going to forego my prepared opening statement, but I simply must respond to the comments of the ranking member, my friend the ranking member, on this particular issue. There is nothing that the chair said, there is nothing implicit in the Take Our Jobs campaign, explicit or implicit, that said Americans aren't doing hard work. And if the gentleman from Iowa were deeply concerned about the conditions on the farms and the wages, I would have noticed more activity to ensure that a number of the laws that apply to all other workers in America apply with equal force to the people who pick our fruits and vegetables in this country. I would see an effort to push greater appropriations and greater funding for people to monitor the working conditions on our farms. I'd see an effort to try and get the rights that all other workers have to collective bargaining extended to farm workers who are excluded from our national collective bargaining legislation. The fact is that while Americans over and over again have produced both their, have shown both their courage and their willingness to undertake terribly difficult jobs, jobs that I would dare to say that people on this podium, including myself, would be very reluctant to take. Study after study, including studies at the time of welfare reform, where huge numbers of people were going to be forced off of the welfare rolls. And in counties where unemployment was 2 or 3 times the average of the country generally, people would rather have no income and no welfare than take the backbreaking jobs that the migrant farm worker has to do every single day. There is a problem here. You can try and cheap seat it all you want, but we know that were it not for immigrant farm workers in this country, there would be no seasonal fresh fruit and vegetable industry. And I join the gentleman wanting better wages and better working conditions, and we should do everything we can to try and improve those conditions. But the facts are the facts. Study after study has demonstrated that these jobs are not taken by U.S. workers even when unemployed, even when having no other significant means of support. And nothing that, no rhetorical flourishes can hide that fact. I commend the gentlelady for holding this hearing. I want to pay a special recognition to my friend, a dear friend for a number of years, the President of the United Farm Workers Union, Arturo Rodriguez, and the other witnesses as well. And I apologize for not being able to, I hope to come back when my hearing is over, but not to be here for the entire hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Berman. We would now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Smith, for his opening statement, and he will be followed by Mr. Conyers, and then just to keep it even, we'll invite Mr. Lofgrun to have an opening statement, and other members will be invited to submit opening statements to the record. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. American workers face tough economic times. With unemployment almost 10% for the first time in a generation, jobs have become scarce and millions of families are hurting. The Pew Hispanic Center estimates that there are more than 7 million illegal workers in the United States. Alexander Alenikoff, Clinton administration INS official and now UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, calls it a myth that there are little or no competition between undocumented workers and American workers. This competition has had devastating effects on the most vulnerable of Americans. Over 32% of native-born workers without a high school degree are either unemployed, forced to work part-time, or too discouraged to even look for work. For native-born Hispanics without a high school degree, the rate is 35%. For native-born African Americans without a high school degree, the rate is 43%. We could make millions of jobs available to American citizens and legal immigrants if the federal government simply enforced our immigration laws. About half of agricultural workers are illegal immigrants. So that means that a substantial number of legal workers labor in the fields, perhaps as many as half. Certainly even more would take these jobs if the wages and working conditions were better. The most effective means we have to save jobs for Americans are U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement worksite enforcement actions. Each time they detain and deport an illegal worker, they create a job opportunity for an American worker. Each time the Department of Justice sanctions an employer, it sends a clear message that the employment of illegal workers will not be tolerated. Unfortunately, this administration is turning its back on American workers. Worksite administrative arrests have fallen 79% since 2008. Criminal arrests have fallen 62%. It is hard to conceive of a worse time to cut worksite enforcement efforts by more than half, and yet that is what the Obama administration has done. The Department of Homeland Security will tell you that they have increased the number of worksite audits of employers. Employers consider the small fines just the cost of doing business. And what happens to the illegal workers? They walk down the street and take another job that could have gone to an American worker. Citizens and legal immigrants should not be forced to compete with illegal immigrants for scarce the interest of American workers first. Let me point out that one witness, Stephen Colbert, has shed some light on the issue of jobs Americans supposedly won't do. A few years ago, when debating himself on his show, he asked, quote, "Don't we want to have cheap labor for all the jobs we don't want to do?" End quote. He responded, "Yeah, unless you're an American landscaper or an American construction worker." Then he added, "But I am an American TV host. My job is safe." Millions of Americans wish they didn't have to compete with cheap foreign labor and had such a safe job. Unfortunately, 17 million American workers are out of job or have given up looking for work. It's no laughing matter to pretend that Americans don't want jobs. Pay them more if needed, but don't insult American workers by telling them the government cares more about illegal workers than U.S. citizens. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Conyers would be recognized for any opening statement he may wish to give at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is so important here. I'd like to propose to my good friend, the ranking member, Steve King, that we form this committee so that we can get everybody to work very quickly. Between you and I, we could probably recruit hundreds of thousands of people and solve this problem, even though the farm workers couldn't do it. Senator Feinstein wasn't too successful. And you say it's pretty easy, so I'd like to work with you on this. What do you say?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you yielding to me, and I've actually recruited farm workers and hired them and paid them, and so what I had to do was raise the wages and benefits in order to attract people, and I know that people are migrant. The Okies went to California for jobs, and so if you offer the wages and the market and demand will provide the value, then the workers will show up. The legal workers will show up.
So the answer is yes.
Be happy to do that, and hopefully we can consider that labor is a commodity like corn or beans or tomatoes, and that a supply and demand establishes its value in the marketplace.
And you wouldn't have any objection to them being organized, members of a union?
I think here in America, if you want to market your skills and you're a legal worker, you do it the way you best can market your skills.
Right. Well, thanks a lot. I'll see you after the hearing. We'll get started.
I look forward to that, Mr. Chairman.
All right. And now to Stephen Colbert, who I enjoy and have for many years. I'm so happy that you've helped us fill the room, and I haven't seen this many cameras since when, Madam Chair? Been a while.
Maybe it was impeachment, but it's been a long time since we've had this kind of coverage.
That's a haunting remembrance. Now, here's what I suggest so that our Republican colleagues we can get to the bottom of this. Mr. Colbert has presented us with a fine statement. It'll be entered into the record. He's got a huge march coming on October 30th, Saturday, here in Washington, which many people are going to be at, I know. I've got a very good feeling about that. I'll be busy working in Michigan trying to turn out the vote. We've been having a very low voter turnout, so that's the only reason I won't be with you in the march. But I would like to recommend that now that we've got all this attention, that you excuse yourself and that you let us get on with the three witnesses and all the other members there, and we're sure it'll be shown on the show tonight, and maybe Monday. I don't know. You run your show. We run the committee. But what do you say to that, Stephen? You didn't hear the question? You don't understand the question. The question was that. No, I'm not asking you not to talk. I'm asking you to leave the committee room completely and submit your statement instead.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'm wondering if, from where Mr. Colbert's microphone isn't on and can't be heard, but whether, having posed the question, we could listen to Mr. Lundgren and Mr. Colbert can ponder what you've said. I think many are eager to hear his comments.
That's fair enough.
I'm here at the invitation of the chairwoman, and if she would not. I'm here at the invitation of the chairwoman, and if she would like me to remove myself from the hearing room, I'm happy to do so. I'm only here at her invitation.
That is correct.
Thank you very much. That's fair enough.
The gentleman's time has expired. We will now hear from Mr. Lundgren, who will make an opening statement, and then, in the interest of proceeding to our witnesses, we will invite other members to submit their statements for the record. Mr. Lundgren.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I've been working on this issue for some 30 years. I confess that I was the Republican floor manager for the Simpson-Mazzoli bill. I thought at that time we had presented a reasonable solution to the problem of illegal immigration in this country. Unfortunately, while the legalization program, which was supposed to be a one-time only program, was successful, there was a total failure with respect to enforcement. We also included in that law the SAW-RAW program, Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, and Replenishment Agricultural Worker Program, both of which were riddled with fraud, which some of us suggested would happen when we opposed that section of the bill. Since that time, and because of the lack of enforcement by the federal government, we have seen a continuation of the flow of illegal immigration in this country, so that it is of a larger dimension than it was back in the 1980s. At the same time, we have the highest rate of unemployment, I believe, in my adult lifetime. And in my district, we have a higher unemployment rate than the state of California, which has a higher unemployment rate than all but 2 states. It is a severe problem. I have agriculture in my district, and I have urban areas in my district. It seems to me that we ought to put all the facts on the table and understand that there are different segments of our economy, most of which, in my opinion, can successfully attract American workers. I see no reason right now for the presumed or the assumed lack of opportunity for African American young males in the construction trades. I see no evidence whatsoever that in the area of construction or landscaping, there's a need for foreign workers. I think the intelligent thing for us to do is to establish laws which would allow us to look economic sector by economic sector and make a determination through our government as to whether or not there is a need for foreign workers. Now, I've never worked in the fields. I've worked on ranches, I've worked in construction, I've worked in shipyards. That's all tough work. I doubt it is as tough as the work I have seen the individuals in the farm fields do. It is really tough work. Being from California, I happen to believe there is evidence that we cannot attract sufficient Americans for agricultural purposes. And therefore, I have always suggested we have to establish a program that works and that the American people determine through their elected officials the contours of, and then on an annual basis we make a determination as to how many people are needed in this country. But I'm sorry my friend Mr. Berman has left, because one of the problems with his Ag Jobs bill is that it grants people the path to citizenship who have been in this country illegally as a major tenet of this program. I don't think that is necessary. And the reason I say that is this. There is an essential notion in our society, I believe, from the time we're on schoolyards and even before that, that cutting in line is unfair. And I have to ask the number of people from the sending countries who followed the law and did not come into this country illegal, but which wish to come to this country, what does it say to them that they get put behind those that were not following the law? So all I would say is this. I think we can reach a satisfactory conclusion to this if we recognize that enforcement in the past was not there and therefore encouraged continuing illegal immigration, a failure to have a workable temporary worker program has caused some of the problem that we have. And I think, thirdly, that you do not have to have an amnesty component in a program. There are other ways we can treat people humanely and deal with this problem without that, because I fear, Madam Chair, that if we have that as a component of any legislation we have, the American people will not support it, and we will fail to deal with a real challenge that we have confronting us today. Among all the issues that we have, we always see that we also have the backdrop of the threat of terrorism today. And I am not and never have suggested that most people who are here illegally are terrorists or that there's a large number of it. All I say is if the longer you have a porous border, the greater opportunity you have for terrorists to take advantage of that. And that is something that we did not have to deal with as we do today. We did not have to deal with in 1984-86 when we were dealing in the Simpson-Mazzoli legislation. So, Madam Chair, I thank you. I'm actually going to thank Mr. Colbert for bringing the attention to the question of workers in the field. It's always tough to say anything to him because you're not sure what's going to happen in return and what will appear on TV. And I know he would never take anything out of context. So that I guess I might as well quit while I'm ahead.
Thank you, and your time has expired. I would like to introduce the panel of witnesses before us. And I will start by introducing Dr. Carol M. Swain. Professor Swain is currently a professor of political science and professor of law at Vanderbilt University and a member of the James Madison Society at Princeton University. She received her bachelor's degree from Roanoke College and her master's from Virginia Polytechnical Institute and State University. She holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and in 2000 she was awarded an MLS from Yale Law School. She specializes in race relations and immigration and is the author of several books, including her most recent, Debating Immigration, a collection of essays by Professor Swain and other scholars on contemporary immigration. Next, I would like to introduce Phil Glaze. Mr. Glaze is a third-generation fruit grower, former chairman of the U.S. Apple Association, a nonprofit membership association serving the interests of the entire American apple industry, and an active member of the Agriculture Coalition for Immigration Reform. U.S. Apple represents a $2 billion industry with over 7,500 commercial growers nationwide. Mr. Glaze's family business grows, packs, and ships apples for the fresh and processed markets and has been producing apples in Shenandoah and Frederick counties, Virginia, since the 1920s. It is my pleasure to introduce our third witness, Arturo Rodriguez. Since 1993, Mr. Rodriguez has served as the president of the United Farm Workers, the largest farm workers union in the United States, founded by Cesar Chavez. A veteran farm labor organizer, he became active with the UFW's Great Boycott as a student in 1969. He holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Michigan and has worked for the UFW since 1973. Mr. Rodriguez has over 35 years of experience organizing farm workers, negotiating union contracts, and leading farm workers across the country for fair wages and working conditions. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Stephen Colbert. Mr. Colbert is the host and executive producer of the Emmy Award and Peabody Award-winning series on Comedy Central, The Colbert Report. The series won the Peabody Award for Excellence in Broadcasting in 2008 and has garnered a total of 15 Emmy nominations. Mr. Colbert and his writing team have won 2 Emmys for outstanding writing for a variety music or comedy program. He recently traveled to an upstate New York vegetable farm to experience the life of a farm worker through the United Farm Workers Take Our Job initiative, and he has also worked with the farm workers to try and publicize their Take Our Jobs Please campaign in the effort to highlight the shortage that we face. Now, each of you has prepared a written statement, and that statement, those written statements, will be made part of our official record. At this point, we would like you to summarize your statement in about 5 minutes. There are little machines on the table. You can see right now they're green. When 4 minutes is up, they'll turn yellow, and when 5 minutes is up, it'll be red. And at that point, we would like you to conclude, not mid-sentence, but sum up, and so that all of the witnesses can be heard, and also so members of the committee will have an opportunity to ask their questions. Well, first, we will go to you, Dr. Swain, for your testimony.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to testify on this important issue. I speak today on behalf of millions of Americans who would like to see immigration laws vigorously enforced. I contend that America does not have a shortage of agricultural workers. Instead, we have a manufactured crisis by some who would like to ensure a steady supply of cheap labor, and in some cases, labor that bypasses the H-2A and H-2B visa programs. The H-2A program is for agricultural workers. The H-2B program is for non-agricultural, mostly low-skilled workers. Labor economist Philip Martin, who has conducted extensive studies of farm labor in the areas of fruit and vegetable production, has found rising production in crops and stagnant wages for the workers. Meanwhile, the cost of household expenditures on fresh fruits and vegetables has remained constant. If there were labor shortages for agricultural workers, one would expect to find rising wages and more attractive working conditions. One would not expect to find unemployment rates of 10.8% in May and 7.9% in August. These unemployment figures indicate that there are Native workers actively seeking employment in the sector that includes agricultural workers, forestry, fishing, and hunting. The majority of agricultural workers have less than a high school education. They work under the most strenuous conditions. Consequently, there is a high turnover rate among these workers. Agricultural workers often leave the farms for other low-wage, low-skill occupations. There they compete directly with low-skilled Americans for a dwindling supply of low-wage jobs. The UFW's humorous Take Our Jobs initiative entirely, or perhaps deliberately, misses the point. America cannot continue to bring in low-skilled guest workers to compete with the most disadvantaged Americans, the poor whites, the blacks, the legal Hispanics, and other people that are here legally. Nor can it continue to turn a blind eye to illegal immigration. Often, surplus labor that starts in the fields migrates into other industries. Without surplus labor, employers would be forced to pay higher wages, and many would be forced to improve substandard working conditions. Instead of paying $8 and $9 per hour, employers might be forced to pay $12 or $13. Phil Martin shows that an increase in the wages of farm workers would not substantially increase the average family's food bill. He estimated that the average family's food bill would rise by about $8 a year. The Take Our Jobs initiative misses the fact that in some parts of the country, Native workers have successfully worked alongside immigrants. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a businessman from Nashville who ran a one-year experiment in Helena, Arkansas, involving sweet potato planting and harvesting. Mr. Don Kerr of Kerr Industries invested over $250,000 of his own money to help unemployed Americans get jobs in the fields in an area of the country where unemployment is around 40% for African Americans. His experiment involved H-2A workers, the agricultural workers that are here on visas, and native-born blacks who were picked up from a central location. They were transported to the job site. They were provided with bathroom, lunchroom facilities, and a decent wage. Mr. Kerr saw no differences in the quality of the work provided by the native-born black American workers, and he concluded that American workers would do farm work if they have transportation and decent working conditions. Even though he had a program that was providing jobs for unemployed Americans, he could not get state or federal agencies to make an investment in the program. He would like to see an independent farm service company created to stand between the workers and the growers. The agency would hire the workers, provide transportation and air-conditioned buses, bathroom and lunch facilities, and would serve as a buffer between the agricultural workers and the growers. The UFW's Take Our Job initiative has not, in my opinion, has not made a serious effort to recruit American workers. This is a publicity stunt. We need to reform immigration. The rapid influx of cheap labor from foreign countries creates an oversupply of labor that works against the interests of Native workers. It depresses their wages, it reduces their opportunities, and it deters employers from investing in Native human capital. Compounding these problems, Native-born blacks and Hispanics suffer more than any other group. You can just look at their unemployment rates, and it's in my testimony. It's off the charts. This is a disgrace. Congress needs to do something about reforming immigration, and they need to protect the most disadvantaged Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swain. We'll turn now to Mr. Glaze for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lofgrun.
Could you turn on the microphone, please? There's a little button. There you go. Nope, it's still not on. We will.
I am honored to testify today on behalf of the U.S. Apple Association and the Agriculture Coalition for Immigration Reform. My name is Phil Glaze. I'm a third-generation fruit farmer with operations in Shenandoah and Frederick Counties, Virginia, and depending upon the time of year, we employ from 30 to 155 workers. The fact that I appear before you today as a farmer with Arturo Rodriguez, the president of UFW, should send a very powerful message. American farmers and the farm workers have a common problem. Despite continued attempts at automation, apples still need to be manually pruned and hand-picked. The work is physically demanding and a certain amount of skill is necessary. Apples bruise easily, and improper picking will greatly reduce the value of our crop. We need a reliable, skilled, and legal workforce. Today, farmers are choosing between a reliable, skilled, and illegal workforce or a bureaucratic, unreliable H-2A program. Without a thoughtful federal legislative solution, farms will fail. We will export U.S. jobs. We will import our food. Who is doing the work on America's farms? Government statistics tell us that hired farm workers are over 80% foreign-born, and over half of those are unauthorized. Private estimates say that as many as 75% are unauthorized. Only 2% of America's farm workers are coming in through the existing H-2A program. Many believe that native-born workers will harvest America's specialty crops. However, the UFW's Take Our Jobs campaign is only the latest in a series of unsuccessful efforts in good and bad times, in Michigan, in Washington, in California, and elsewhere to recruit Americans into farm jobs. Those of us that are struggling to harvest our crops are not surprised that Take Our Jobs is only producing a handful of workers. It isn't about hourly wages. Farm workers can earn more per hour picking apples than flipping burgers or stocking shelves in a big box store. The average picker on my farm earns $93 for a 9-hour day. The better ones earn more. But like so many agricultural jobs, picking apples is highly seasonal. It is out in the weather. It is demanding. I do have a picking bucket full of apples here. I invite every committee member, please, come down, put it on, understand what it's like to fill that thing 150 times a day and go up and down a ladder. Most in this room would probably argue that our immigration system is broken. Some growers are trying to use the H-2A guest worker program but face huge administrative obstacles and uncertainty. Just last month, apple growers in the Northeast had a near disaster when decisions by the State Department and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services put applications of hundreds of Jamaican workers in jeopardy just days before the grower needed them to start harvest. Members of Congress intervened, and the workers arrived at the last moment. A few more days of inaction could have meant losses estimated at $95 million for the affected growers. From a user standpoint, the H-2A program is a mess. The choice between using the dysfunctional H-2A program or hiring workers whose documents look good but may not be is untenable. In the U.S., we have a short window of a couple months to get about 200 million bushels of apples off the trees. As the apples ripen, there is about a 5-day window to pick them at the proper maturity. Different varieties and strains allow us to manage the harvest timing over the course of 8 to 10 weeks. A delay in the arrival of workers has a domino effect that leads to overripe fruit, fruit on the ground, and financial loss. What is most worrisome to me as a grower is the reality that we could lose a large portion or even a whole crop if willing and able pickers are not available. At harvest time, all but the picking costs have been invested. Our lines of credit are fully utilized. We have a leveraged investment that must be converted to cash. If we lose apples to the ground due to a lack of pickers, we could easily be forced to liquidate part of the farm to pay our lenders. This can happen to me quickly and without warning. 1 year is all it will take. The threat of losing farms and all the jobs dependent upon them is real and worsening in the face of congressional inaction. At least 80,000 acres of high-value vegetable production have left Arizona and California for Mexico. 77% of Texas vegetable producers report scaling back due to labor shortfalls. Florida tomatoes and oranges are moving to Mexico and Brazil. China has requested access to our market for fresh apples, and they already produce over 1/2 the world's apples. If the U.S. apple industry is starved for labor, the Chinese are ready to step in and supply our apples. In the face of a crisis, retrieving lost production will not happen quickly. Specialty crop production is extremely risky. Average profitability doesn't really give a proper return given the risk that we take. For most of us, the reasons we stay in it are not economical. A major life goal for me is to provide jobs for as many people as possible. I am compelled to be able to pass on our farm to someone who will take it. Labor shortages are not going to find me a willing buyer. It's a serious economic problem that Congress has not addressed for far too long. Now is the time. I am extremely supportive of ag jobs legislation. Comprehensive reform may be too politically charged right now. Please focus on ag jobs and get it passed. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. We'll turn now to Mr. Rodriguez.
Good morning. I would like to thank Chairwoman Lofgrun, Chairman Conyers, Ranking Member King, and all the members of the committee for holding this hearing and for inviting us. My name is Arturo Rodriguez, and I'm President of the United Farm Workers of America. And joining with me today are 5 farm workers that I'd like to ask them to stand up and then raise their hands when I mention their names. Isabel Rojas has 40 years working in the field. She started at age 12. Rogelio Luna started at age 16, has 46 years working in the fields. Amparo Flores started at 14, 33 years working in the fields. Teresa Serrano, started at 14, working 43 years in the fields. Alfredo Zamora, 17, started working and has 34 years working in the fields. Very proud to be with all of them here today. Today, across America, the harvest season is reaching its peak. More than 1 million men, women, and children are toiling in our nation's fields, producing our fruits and vegetables, and caring for our livestock. Most Americans have the luxury to operate in ignorance or denial about how the food we eat gets on our tables. Agriculture in the United States is dependent on hardworking, dedicated, tax-paying immigrant workforce. 3/4 of all farm workers are born outside the country today. These are the facts. America needs these workers. Everyone in this room is directly sustained by their labors every day. If you had a glass of Florida orange juice with your breakfast this morning, it is almost certain the oranges that went into that juice were picked by unauthorized workers. If you had milk on your cereal, it is likely that the workers who milked the cows didn't have the right papers. When we sit down every day to give thanks for our many blessings, most of the food on your table has been harvested and cared for by unauthorized workers. There is another indisputable fact. The life of a U.S. farm worker in 2010 is not an easy one. Most farm workers live in poverty, endure poor working conditions, and receive no government assistance. Undocumented farm workers take jobs other Americans won't do for pay other American workers won't accept, and under conditions other Americans won't tolerate. Who is to blame? It is not the farm workers' fault that 15 states do not even provide the basic protection of workers' compensation if they are injured at work. It's not the farm workers' fault that more than 70 years after Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, farm workers still do not have a right to organize. It is not the farm workers' fault that year after year, farm labor contractors violate the laws with impunity while the growers employ the contractors, avoid the responsibility for those workers. Our society places all the risks and costs associated with the seasonal industry, featuring millions of short-term jobs on the backs of the workers. For example, if there is a freeze, as occurred many times recently in Florida, thousands of workers are left without work. There is no unemployment assistance for those workers during that particular period. Furthermore, if a worker is injured, oftentimes there's no real recourse, there's no access to worker compensation. So we, the United Farm Workers, initiated the Take Our Jobs campaign, and we did invite citizens and legal residents to apply for jobs on farms across the country to supply our homes, restaurants, and workplace cafeterias, including those in our nation's capital. with the food that fuels the people of this great nation. Since June the 24th, we received 8,600 inquiries through our website, takeourjobs.org, but only 7 people have accepted those jobs on a full-time basis and continuing to work in agriculture. Indeed, if we deported all undocumented farm workers here now, the government estimates U.S. agriculture would need to hire at least 1 million citizens or legal residents to replace the immigrant laborers. A mass deportation of agriculture workers would cause the collapse of the agricultural industry as we know it, and we feel that would have a severe impact on maintaining a very much needed industry in our society today, as well as providing American consumers with safe food. We continue our work. We urge that ag jobs be passed here by the Congress, that you seriously look at that and giving legal status to those farm workers that are here today. The growers, the employers, the agricultural industry is asking for a secure farm labor force. We think it's the obligation of this committee as well as this Congress to take action immediately on that issue. Now is the time for Congress to acknowledge its role in creating what exists today as our current farm labor crisis and to offer a real and lasting solution. It is time to acknowledge the dignity of the current farm labor workforce and ensure the safety and abundance of America's food supply by passing the Ag Jobs Bill. A failure to do so would be both a human and economic tragedy. Thank you very much.
Now we will turn to our...
Madam Chairman, could I just say that after listening to Dr. Carol Swain, I withdraw my previous request that I had made to Stephen Colbert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we will turn now to Mr. Colbert for his 5 minutes of testimony.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Colbert, and I am an American citizen. It is an honor and a privilege to be here today. Congresswoman Lofgrun asked me to share my vast experience spending one day as a migrant farm worker. I am happy to use my celebrity to draw attention to this important, complicated issue, and I certainly hope that my star power can bump this hearing all the way up to C-SPAN 1. As we've heard this morning, America's farms are presently far too dependent on immigrant labor to pick our fruits and vegetables. Now, the obvious answer is for all of us to stop eating fruits and vegetables. And if you look at the recent obesity statistics, you'll see that many Americans have already started. Unfortunately, my gastroenterologist, Dr. Eichler, has informed me in no uncertain terms that they are a necessary source of roughage. As evidence, I would like to submit a video of my colonoscopy into the Congressional Record. Now, we all know there is a long tradition of great nations importing foreign workers to do their farm work. After all, it was the ancient Israelites who built the first food pyramids. But this is America. I don't want a tomato picked by a Mexican. I want it picked by an American, then sliced by a Guatemalan and served by a Venezuelan in a spa where a Chilean gives me a Brazilian. Because my great-grandfather did not travel across 4,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean to see this country overrun by immigrants. He did it because he killed a man back in Ireland. That's the rumor. I don't know if that's true. I'd like to have that stricken from the record. So we do not want immigrants doing this labor. And I agree with Congressman King, we must secure our borders. Of course, I'm sure Arturo Rodriguez is saying, who then would pick our crops, Stephen? First of all, Arturo, don't interrupt me when I'm talking. That's rude. Second, I reject this idea that farm work is among the semi-mythical jobs that Americans won't do. Really? No Americans. I did. As part of my ongoing series, Stephen Colbert's Fallback Position, where I try other jobs and realize that mine is way better. I participated in the UFW's Take Our Jobs campaign, one of only 16 people in America to take up the challenge. Though that number may increase in the near future, as I understand, many Democrats may be looking for work come November. Now, I'll admit, I started my workday with preconceived notions of migrant labor. But after working with these men and women, picking beans, packing corn, for hours on end, side by side, in the unforgiving sun, I have to say, and I do mean this sincerely, please don't make me do this again. It is really, really hard. For one thing, when you're picking beans, you have to spend all day bending over. It turns out, and I did not know this, most soil is at ground level. If we can put a man on the moon, why can't we make the earth waist high? Come on, where is the funding? This brief experience gave me some small understanding of why so few Americans are clamoring to begin an exciting career as seasonal migrant field worker. So, what's the answer? I'm a free market guy. Normally, I would leave this to the invisible hand of the market, but the invisible hand of the market has already moved over 84,000 acres of production and over 22,000 farm jobs to Mexico, and shut down over 1 million acres of U.S. farmland due to lack of available labor, because apparently even the invisible hand doesn't want to pick beans. Now, I'm not a fan of the government doing anything, but I've got to ask, why isn't the government doing anything? Maybe this ag jobs bill would help. I don't know. Like most members of Congress, I haven't read it. But maybe we could offer more visas to the immigrants who, let's face it, will probably be doing these jobs anyway. And this improved legal status might allow immigrants recourse if they're abused. And it just stands to reason to me that if your coworker can't be exploited, then you're less likely to be exploited yourself. And that itself might improve pay and working conditions on these farms, and eventually Americans may consider taking these jobs again. Or maybe that's crazy. Maybe the easier answer is just to have scientists develop vegetables that pick themselves. The genetic engineers over at Fruit of the Loom have made great strides in human fruit hybrids. The point is, we have to do something, because I am not going back out there. At this point, I break into a cold sweat at the side of a salad bar. I thank you for your time. Again, it is an honor, a privilege, and a responsibility to be here. I trust that following my testimony, both sides will work together on this issue in the best interest of the American people, as you always do. I'm now prepared to take your questions and/or pose for pictures with your grandchildren. I yield the balance of my time. USA #1.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of the witnesses for their testimony. We will now begin questions of any of our witnesses, and we will begin, if Mr. Conyers is ready at this time, I will recognize Mr. Conyers for his questions for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate all the testimony of all the witnesses. I have to observe that Mr. Colbert's submitted statement was considerably different from the one that he presented, but that's a small detail. Right. Dr. Carol Swain, you've written and studied about this subject quite a bit, and what I'm interested in knowing is that you spoke of a conversation you had with a grower who had a program to provide jobs to African Americans, but in your written testimony you state that he closed the program because he couldn't get federal or state agencies to invest money. Now, what it sounds like to me is that the grower couldn't make it profitable without government investment, right?
He invested $250,000 of his own money, and he has worked with Blanche Lincoln and other members of Congress on these agriculture issues. He's very much, this is a white
yeah, but he couldn't get enough money.
He's very much involved in issues affecting people that are disadvantaged.
I know he's a good guy, but he couldn't get enough money, right?
He could not get members, he could not get
Is that
state,
right or
local,
wrong?
or federal officials to invest in a program that was providing employment for Americans.
He couldn't get enough money, right?
I don't understand your point.
Well, you don't have to understand the point.
It's the
Is it right or wrong? He didn't get enough money, and that's why he went out of business, even though he invested a lot of his money. He was a good guy.
He didn't go out of business. Curry Industries is a very well-known, profitable company. He didn't go out of business. He's a Nashville
But he
businessman.
closed the program.
Closed the program, or he started the program in Arkansas.
Why did he close it?
Because he could not get members of Congress and state and local officials to be interested in the plight of disadvantaged Americans. And so he spends his energies in other places.
Do you really know that? I mean, I don't know anybody on this committee, and not too many in the Congress, that aren't.
Mr. Conyers, you should read
Just
my
a moment,
book, especially
please.
the chapter on the Black Caucus and how they're not representing African American interests on this particular issue.
Well, I'm glad Maxine Waters isn't here today. Boy, oh boy. Well, the point that really this discussion comes down to is that Dan Lofgrun, my dear friend from California, former Attorney General, he doesn't like the Berman bill, but he doesn't have a bill. Steve King and I are forming a committee afterward to make sure that...
I do have a bill.
Oh, you do have a bill. Oh, thank you. What's the number? Well, we'll find it. If you say you have one, your word is your bond. But Steve King and I are forming a committee to recruit people. And Dr. Swain, you're from Vanderbilt. You must know that only 4% of the people doing this kind of stoop labor are African Americans, right?
If Americans are not
right or wrong?
Jobs, it's because they're not paying that much. The American workers are being undercut by the surplus of cheap labor.
I presume that you're saying...
labor to paying a decent wage to American workers.
I presume you're saying yes.
I'm not in a court of law, so I don't have to say yes or no.
Oh, okay. And you're not under oath either. No, we don't want to know. Well,
but I do hope that you all would look at Mr. Kerr's suggestions. He's been a grower, probably for 30 or 40 years, and he has the industry, and he's made some suggestions that I think that...
Well, have you looked at Mr. Rodriguez's suggestions?
I've read everyone's testimony.
Well, what do you think of his? He's representing all those fine people that have, with the red shirts that are sitting in back of you. What do you think of his? What do you think of his position?
I would like nothing better than to see farm workers well paid and have decent working conditions.
Of course not. Of course you do. But what do you think of Rodriguez's position? Are you in agreement with him?
Well, as long as their unemployment figures are right now for August, 7.9% unemployment in the agricultural sector, I can't agree that there's a shortage of workers. I do believe that...
Okay, I'm going to close, Madam Chair, but could I invite you to join me and Mr. King on this committee?
I would love to work on these immigration issues because...
Would you join our committee after the hearing?
The American people. I'm not a member of Congress, but I represent the American people.
The gentleman's time.
I would love to work with you.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the ranking member has asked that we go next to Mr. Smith, and who will be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Swain, thank you for your excellent testimony, and thank you for trying to answer all the questions that you've been asked. I have a couple of more questions, and the first is this. Why aren't the interests of the American people being better represented?
Well, I think it's because the American people are not organized in lobbies and are trying to make a living, and so they're not in the pressure groups that seem to have the most influence over members of Congress.
Okay. And you mentioned or referred in your testimony to the danger of sort of what we might call chain guest workers. And if they come in and are allowed to stay, they're going to probably take another job at a higher pay as soon as they can. What are the consequences of that?
Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that in some areas of the country, African Americans, they work in hotels, they work in restaurants, they do yard work, they do that. There is a displacement of American workers, and whenever there's a crackdown all of those jobs that we're told that Americans will not take, you see thousands of Americans, hundreds of them lining up to take those jobs. And so there are employers that would prefer immigrant labor because it's easier to exploit that labor.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Swain. Mr. Colbert, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions if I could. First of all, let me say that I think you made some good points, particularly about Democrats in November, and particularly about the need for members of Congress to read bills. I hope our Democratic congressional leadership was listening to you. It so happens that I'm going to take that as an endorsement of the Republicans' pledge to Americans, because we have a provision in there that requires the leadership to give 72 hours of notice of any bill that we have before we vote on it on the House floor. Let me give you a second opportunity to be a little bit more serious, because I know you do take this subject seriously. I'd like to ask you about your experience when you worked for one day in the field in upstate New York. How many other workers were there with you that day?
I didn't take a count. I'm not good with math. I would say 50. How many people were out in the field?
50, something like that?
About 100 people were out there in the field.
How many of those individuals were illegal and how many were legal?
I didn't ask them for their papers, though I had a strong urge to.
Okay. We assume that if you don't know they were illegal, there might well have been legal workers there. Is that correct?
I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, if you don't know, then it's hard to say that they were all illegal workers. My point being that if some of them were legal, and I presume they were, that does show that Americans are willing to do those jobs. Do you know how much those workers were paid?
I don't know. Even if they were legal, I don't know if they were American citizens.
You don't know what?
Even if they were legal, I don't know if they were American citizens.
Okay. Well, my question was, do you know how much they were paid by the hour?
I don't know. I don't know. I didn't do a good enough job to get paid, so I can't compare my salary to anyone.
Right.
I was actually asked to leave.
Gosh. To me, how much they get paid is a pretty serious subject, and if they need to get paid more for us to attract American workers, we should, I think, do so. I know you're an expert comedian. I know you're an expert entertainer. I know you have a great sense of humor. But would you call yourself an expert witness when it comes to farm labor issues or not?
I believe I was invited here today by the Congresswoman because I was one of the 16 people who took the United Farm Workers up on the experience of having migrant farm work for a single day. And if there are other members of the committee who did that, then there's no purpose of me being here. But if there isn't, I might
does one day in the field make you an expert witness?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Does one day working in the field make you an expert witness, do you think?
I believe one day of me studying anything makes me an expert in something.
Is that to say it's more work than you've ever done before, right?
Excuse me?
It's more work than you've ever done before in that
It's certainly
category.
harder work than this.
Is it harder work than the comedy show?
Excuse me?
Is it harder work than the comedy show?
It's absolutely harder than punditry.
Okay, and you don't want to return to it? Okay.
I will never, I don't even want to watch Green Acres anymore.
Well, like I say, I'm happy you're here. I do think you made some good points, but...
By the way, I do endorse your policies. I do endorse Republican. You asked me if I endorse Republican policies.
Okay. Do you endorse
I endorse all Republican policies without question.
Okay, including the requirement that members have 72 hours to read a bill before we vote on it?
Absolutely.
Thank you for your endorsement of the Pledge to America. Madam Chair, I'll yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I would turn now to the gentle lady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This is a crucial hearing because I think it involves constitutional principles of the equality and justice that we demand in this nation, and I thank the witnesses for their presence here today. I want to say to Dr. Swain that I don't disagree with you that this nation should not turn a blind eye to illegal immigration. In fact, we should engage. And frankly, for almost a decade, in my tenure in this Congress, we have tried to fairly engage in the question of illegal immigration by putting forward a plan of comprehensive immigration reform that addresses the question of a process, if you will, of access to citizenship. Lamar Smith and I, over the years, have talked about the importance of providing a widespread view of Americans and creating jobs and ensuring that there is an investment in the skills of Americans. And so we probably don't disagree on that. We find ourselves, however, in the political climate where if right was right and truth was truth, we could not find on this committee a bipartisan pathway to be able to effectively deal with fixing the immigration system, doing some of the things that you've said, which means that we could, in fact, members of this side of the aisle have agreed that we could take some of those fees and invest in training, for example. We did that. Training nurses, training farm workers, maybe, training others that happen to be, as you have declared, people here in the United States. So we wish we could take up your challenge because that would be the right thing to do. But we find ourselves in a dilemma where we can't get anyone that is on the other side of the aisle to look reasonably at the crisis that we face. To Mr. Colbert, let me say to you, your last sentence in your testimony submitted is something I agree with. They say that you truly know a man after you walked a mile in his shoes, and while I have nowhere near the hardships of these struggling immigrants, I have been granted a sliver of insight. So I want to pose these series of questions and start first with Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Rodriguez, how do you rebut the comment that Dr. Swain made that your effort was a bogus effort to try and find American workers to work in the farms of America?
Let me just first respond. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Lee. We came up with this idea and this concept actually sitting down and meeting with some of the farm workers that I just introduced to you. We were trying to discuss how do we help sensitize and inform the American public about this particular issue in a way that everyone could hopefully better understand. And so as a result of that, the workers came up with a suggestion, well, let's invite legal citizens, let's invite politicians, let's invite policymakers to come and work in the field so they can understand that farm workers are not here and immigrant workers are not here to take away American jobs. So as a result of that, after discussion, we came up with the idea of Take Our Jobs campaign, and consequently, we received a very interesting response from people upon doing that. And when Mr. Colbert decided to also invite us to come on the show and talk about that, it further gave more visibility to that particular issue.
But the question is, she said that you were not serious.
We're very serious.
And
we
so
wanted to prove the point.
Refute quickly that you were not serious. You worked hard and continue to work hard. Is the program still in place?
We work very hard. We have people dedicated every day to listening to individuals that call into us, checking our websites, trying to assist.
So you are serious about it, and we welcome workers. Mr. Colbert, when I spoke about the landscape of immigration reform, I take it that you have had enough experience that, are you speaking only to farm workers, or do you see the value in America answering the call and concern of Dr. Swain and not turning a blind eye to immigration and looking at immigration comprehensively? Do you think it's long overdue for this nation to pass a comprehensive immigration reform plan that looks at all aspects of those who are undocumented, who are seeking an opportunity, particularly young people who have come here and are undocumented and need to access our colleges and schools?
I think there are way too many undocumented Mexican workers here in the United States doing jobs, and I think that we've ignored this issue for too long, and it is time to roll up our sleeves and face this issue mano a whatever the Spanish word for mono is.
The gentle ladies.
Well, Madam Chair, let me just conclude by saying I appreciate Mr. Colbert, but I hope that this hearing will lead to the foundation for comprehensive immigration reform, which I truly believe is the underpinnings of what America is all about. Mr. Rodriguez, no job should be diminished. No job. And the workers that are behind you, their job is not diminished. And I think we can work alongside of each other and tell America that we're better working
The
together.
gentlelady's time
I
has
yield back.
expired.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Madam Chair.
before recognizing Mr. Poe, I just would want to note for the ranking member that the Democratic rule is that all bills must be posted 72 hours in advance on the Internet. And I would yield now to Mr. Poe for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since I have no life, I actually do read the bills, including the health care bill. And I also read the Arizona law, unlike some people in the administration. But I want to thank you all for being here. It's always good to see a fellow Texan, Mr. Rodriguez, for being here as well. There are several issues that I see. One, legal immigration versus illegal immigration. Legal workers versus illegal workers. I think that the problem is the illegal workers. If the country needs more legal immigrants to work, that is an issue that needs to be solved. And the answer is not to just allow more illegals in the country. The answer is to solve the legal process to come here to work as a migrant worker. That seems to be the problem I think should be solved. The other issue I see is wages. Based on what your testimony, your written testimony is, a person that works as a worker in the field can make up to $300 or probably $360 a week. That varies from farm to farm. A person can draw unemployment in the United States as a citizen up to about $390 a week. So if Americans are unemployed and receiving unemployment and the wages are so low in the farm industry, they lose the motivation to work because people in the farm industry are underpaid, whether they're legal workers or illegal workers. And as far as jobs that Americans won't do, I represent Southeast Texas. I represent people that work offshore. And you talk about hard jobs, that's working offshore. Those hard jobs are a lot of jobs that are very tough for Americans to do. But they do that because they get compensated for the work that they do. So low wages seems to be the issue here, not whether or not we should allow people to stay in the country or be in the country illegally. To let people come in if we need those unemployed Americans, 4.5 million of which are drawing up to $390 a week unemployment for up to 99 weeks. Now, Dr. Swain, I want to go back to some of your testimony and ask you to kind of rectify and resolve these issues that I have just mentioned and see how, because I represent a great number of minorities in Port Arthur, Texas. 14% of them are unemployed in Port Arthur, Texas. And how would you see a system to create fair wages, compensated wages, wages where everybody's paying taxes, not just some people paying taxes? How would you see Congress moving in a direction regarding legal immigrants to work and also getting more Americans working?
Well, the first thing I think that we need to do is, as I said before, enforce the existing laws and to put it, the E-Verify program that the federal government already has, and many people are voluntarily signing up for that program. That program, if it was mandatory across the country, it would create opportunities for American workers because there are millions of illegal immigrants that are working on the payrolls that should not have jobs. These are jobs that should go to American workers. And so I think that we need to enforce the laws that are on the books and then see how much surplus labor we may need. If we have a labor shortage after we enforce our laws, then we need to look at the guest worker programs and see how they need to be changed. I think it should be easier for people to come to the United States legally, and that we should reward those that do it the right way, that come legally, and not allow their interests, to somehow be the interests of people that come here legally. They seem to get the worst end of the deal. I have friends that are immigrants that are trying to do it the right way, and many of them feel like that they would get a better deal if they were to fall out of status and become illegal rather than to try to do it a way that's legal. And I'd like to respond to the comment about the Take Out Jobs initiative. The very fact that they named it Take Out Jobs is a deterrence, because it assumes the name itself implies that the jobs belong to someone else. And so the immigrants are saying, take out jobs. I don't know many people that would want to take a job that belonged to someone else.
Mr. Rodriguez, let me ask you a generic question. In the farm working industry, approximately how many people working in the industry that are foreign nationals are legally here, illegally here? Can you give me a percentage?
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Congressman. The estimate is by the federal government, Department of Labor, about 53%. Based on my own experience after being out there all the time, probably more like 70 to possibly 75% are unauthorized workers that are working in the agricultural workforce today.
All right. Just one last comment. I agree with Dr. Swain that we need to fix the legal immigration system. It is too complicated. It takes too long. And with that, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you very much. And I will turn now to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I find this hearing to be most interesting. And the question of whether or not immigrant workers are taking jobs from Americans, and African Americans have been mentioned an awful lot here today. And I'm so pleased to hear that so many people are interested in African Americans getting jobs. I'm also interested in the fact that all of a sudden we're hearing discussion about increased wages when one of the biggest struggles we've had in this Congress is increasing the minimum wage. And so this is very enlightening to me as I listen to some of the interest, particularly of some of my colleagues on the opposite side of the aisle. Let me just say this, that of course, there are Americans and African Americans who would work on some of these jobs, but let me just assure you, for the people in my district, this is not a high priority for the kind of job they would like to have. I imagine very desperate ones would take some of these jobs for a limited period of time if it was, if it concerned their survival. But if I had to support subsidizing corporations to hire workers, I would not put my emphasis on farm labor. I would put my emphasis on construction jobs. For example, in my district, a lot of young people who are not well educated ask for and seek out the opportunity to work on construction jobs. We had one program that was laying fiber optics that many of the young people who did not have skills learned to do this kind of work. So whether we're talking about in construction or communications industry, where training is available and possible, I would subsidize employers to increase those kind of jobs. I would also subsidize employers to bring jobs from offshore back into the United States, where they would be in the inner cities and in the urban areas, because this business of talking about transportation from urban areas to rural areas is just unreal. It is not something that is workable. So I'd like to focus a little bit on comprehensive immigration reform, because I think that's really what we should be talking about. And I'd like to ask my friend, Mr. Rodriguez, who I've known for many years, and proud to say that I was in the California legislature when Howard Berman led the way on all of the reforms that we did for immigrant workers, working with Cesar Chavez. And I think he was one of the most profound organizers of our time. Let me ask you, in immigration reform, if we talk about allowing citizenship to be made available to farm workers, how would you frame that? Would you say that if you've been here working without papers for 4 years, 5 years, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, you should be afforded citizenship? How would you do that?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Waters. In fact, we do have a solution, and what the legislation that Mr. Berman and the other member of the Congress, Adam Putnam, have put together and fashioned it to deal with the agricultural industry specifically, is that a worker that worked 150 days in agriculture in the previous 2 years would be allowed to become part of the Ag Jobs program, as we call the legislation. But farm workers would not get automatic legalization, as we talked about before. They would be put into a program of earned legalization whereby they would have to continue working in agriculture for the next 3 to 5 years. In addition, they would be paying upwards of $500 million overall within the entire group of fines for being here and coming into the country undocumented. And
I'll get that. Let me just ask you quickly, because I want to get this in on comprehensive immigration reform. Would you support significant fines for employers who break the law?
once we get this settled, and once we deal with this particular issue, yes, I think there should be an enforcement policy put into place to make sure that we don't have continued immigrants coming in that would violate those laws.
Do you think there are some immigrants who should be deported for some reason, whether they're criminals or some other kinds of reasons?
If an immigrant has committed and violated serious laws here within our country, yes, that is a reason for their deportation at this time.
And would you support in immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, some way of keeping families together where you have undocumented immigrants who have been here for a period of time, children were born here, they are legal, and at some point in time, the mother or father may be faced with deportation? How would you deal with that?
The gentlelady's time has expired, so we'll ask him to answer.
Thank you.
Okay. I would support any immigration reform, whether it's comprehensive or Ag Jobs or the DREAM Act, that work to keep families together. That's the basis of our society, to have families together. Immigrant families want to be together just like any other American family.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And we turn now to Mr. Lundgren for his 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just might respond when you said that there is a Democratic caucus rule of a 72-hour notice. Perhaps you ought to inform your leadership, since just 3 weeks ago I received no notice of a bill that contained part of a bill I'd introduced to get rid of the 1099 requirement on small business that's in the health care bill. Our leadership was given 10 seconds notice. 10 seconds notice.
Would the gentleman yield?
Happy if you can give me more than 10 seconds.
It's not a Democratic caucus rule, it's a House rule, and the measure that the gentleman is discussing was actually on the suspension calendar, which has a different section. But
so there is an exception to the 72-hour
on the suspension
rule,
calendar,
so long as you are in command.
which requires a two-thirds vote, as you know, Mr.
I understand that, but let's just make it clear, 10 seconds is not 72 hours, and perhaps you ought to inform your leadership of that rather than the caucus. I'd like to ask Mr. Rodriguez this. If you estimate that 75% of those working in the fields are here illegally, 25%, I presume, are here legally, how are we able to attract that 25%, since presumably they're subjected to the same price structure and working conditions as the others?
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. As I introduce the individuals that are here, there's tens of thousands of farm workers that are here legally, working here legally, that have been in agriculture for a long time, as the ones that I just introduced to you. And they have been here, they've worked hard, they work with the employers that they enjoy working with, they enjoy the work that they do, and they continue to do so. They have good wages where they work at, they have good benefits, medical plan, pension plan, vacations, paid holidays, like any other American worker here in this country.
So are you telling us that the 25% that are successfully recruited to the agricultural fields are recruited successfully because they get appropriate wages and they get appropriate working conditions?
I think that's one factor. In addition to that, The employers that have unauthorized workers working with them also oftentimes want to see those employees continue working with them.
I realize that, but that's not my question.
They value those workers.
That's not my question. My question is, I'm trying to work this thing out. I'm trying to figure out if your premise is that we don't have people going into the fields because Americans won't take those jobs. You then tell me that 25% of those people in the fields are Americans, and so my question is, how are we able to successfully attract them, and is it different than the conditions and wages available to the other 75? And if that be so, could we attract a larger number of Americans replicating what we do for that 25% that are Americans working in the field?
I think our solution is realistic right now and practical.
Okay.
The agricultural industry needs these workers now. They have a workforce that they've worked with now for many years. All we're asking is to give them the opportunity to have legal status in this country.
I understand,
and then
that's not my question.
As a result of that, conditions will improve, wages will improve, the likelihood of American consumers having a good, safe food supply will also be secured.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. And I'd like to ask both you and Mr. Glaze, is it an absolute essential to the Ag Jobs Bill that the people who would benefit from it on the workers' side are allowed to be on the path to citizenship and thereby be put in front of the line of others who follow the law?
They are not going to be put in front of the line. Farm workers that would be included under ag jobs would have to work in agriculture for the next, minimally for the next 3 to 5 years in order to be qualified to even get a green card. They would not get a green card until after they've been able to demonstrate that they've continued to work in agriculture for a certain period of time.
Okay,
and then they'll be able to get a green card, which does not put them in front of the line, just gives them an opportunity then to go and
Okay, well, let me ask this question. One of the major sending countries is Mexico. How long does one have to wait in Mexico if one wants to get in line to get legal entry into the United States and work towards a green card?
I have no idea. I don't have any idea because the workers that I work with, unfortunately, come in a different...
Well, but see, that's the question of whether they're in the front of the line or not. If people have to wait longer than 3 years or 5 years or 8 years or 10 years to get in line legally, and you're saying that these folks qualify automatically, they are being put in front of the line. Mr. Glaze, is it essential to your program...
Could I just clarify that one?
Well, let me just ask Mr. Glaze, is it essential to your program, Mr. Glaze, that they be put on the path towards citizenship as opposed to another type of legal status?
The gentleman's time has expired, so we'll ask Mr. Glaze to respond.
Congressman Lofgrun, let me say thank you very much for your efforts to actually fix this problem. It is essential that the workers that are here now be allowed to have work authorization for a period of X number of years. The Ag Jobs contemplates a fixing of the H-2A program, which we've had lots of testimony here stating that let's figure out how to legally bring workers to pick these crops. That is of the utmost importance. In the meantime, I cannot afford to lose a crop 1 year. Now, the status down the road, I think that is a part of our American willingness to accept immigrants in this country. And putting them at the front of the line, I agree with Mr. Rodriguez. No, they don't go to the front of the line. They will have work authorization for a period of years, and then they can seek their citizenship at that time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Then, as time has expired, I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to all the panelists who are here today. I've heard so many interesting and somewhat, I think, outrageous claims today. I kind of don't even know where to begin with some of the questioning, but I just want to start by making an observation. If, as some members of the panel have suggested, that these immigrant workers are taking jobs that Americans want, then I would expect that there would be zero unemployment in the agricultural sector, and I would expect that many, many Americans would be rushing during this tough economic time to take these jobs, and yet, Mr. Rodriguez, how many people did you say actually inquired about going out to take a job in the fields?
We had about 3 million hits on our website since June 24th. Of that group, 8,600 8,600 were serious about trying to apply for it. And of that group, we have documented 7 people that are actually working out in the fields right now.
And did those 7 remain in that job?
As far as we know right now, they're still working there, yes.
Okay. But there was a huge drop-off between the inquiries and the actual people who signed up and went out and did that work. Is that not correct?
An incredible drop-off.
Okay. And forgive me, but I'm just going to add my 2 cents here. I think that the Take Our Jobs campaign, I have a hard time believing that if you just called it Take a Job campaign, that those 8,000 people would all be working in the field today, but that's just my personal opinion. I don't think the semantics of what you call the campaign is. I think once people probably figured out what the work actually entailed, that's where the big drop-off came. Would you say that that's maybe an accurate assessment, Mr. Rodriguez?
Yes, and we were not trying to, we didn't go to any experts to try to design this campaign. As I mentioned earlier today, my testimony, it was farm workers who really suggested to invite people to come and work in the fields because they were tired of hearing all the criticism that they as farm workers, as immigrants, were taking away American jobs. So,
thank you, Mr. Rodriguez, and I'm not trying to cut you off, but I'm trying to get through some of these questions. Now, the next point that I find incredibly interesting is that I'm hearing from colleagues on the other side of the aisle and some of the panelists that, well, the reason why Americans don't take these jobs is because, gosh, the pay isn't high enough. And, you know, the working conditions are bad. And I think it's interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, most agricultural workers in this country aren't covered by things like workers' compensation law, minimum wage law, overtime law, right to organize. Am I correct in stating that, Mr. Rodriguez?
yes, you are.
So it seems to me that if you really want the wages to go up in this industry, as you say you do, so that then American workers would want this job, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and some of the panelists would really be advocates for labor reform, particularly in the agricultural sector. And yet I have in front of me some information regarding some votes that we've taken here in Congress on specific things that would help raise wages for workers, like H.R. 2, the minimum wage increase, increasing the federal minimum wage by $2.10 over 2 years from $5.15. And I note that Mr. King, Mr. Gallagher, and Mr. Lofgrun all voted no on that particular bill, and I just find it sort of contradictory that they would be saying the wages need to be higher, and yet when we try to raise the wages for workers across this country, they're voting no. I want to get on to Mr. Glaze. I will not. I've got some questions that I want to ask. Mr. Glaze, you spoke of the number of farms, including many in my home state of California, who have moved or are considering moving their operations overseas. And I would like for you to talk in a little bit greater detail about why a farm would move operations to another country and what that does to our local economies in this country when those farms relocate, and how can we reduce the incentive for those farms to relocate in other countries?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, essentially, I'm a small business person, and I need to make a profit. I operate by supply and demand, world supply, and essentially, if a farm is going to not be able to grow, harvest, pack and sell its crop at a profit, then that farmer is going to go out of business. The foods that that farmer was producing will come from somewhere else. Our apples compete with Chilean apples right now. The price of our galas are low right now, probably by about $2 a box because of the Chilean apples that are in the market. If I cannot continue to grow and produce apples and sell them at a profit, I'll go out of business. I won't have anything to pass on to the kid that was holding up the picking bucket.
And everybody who's supported by that business here in the United States would lose their jobs as well. Is that correct?
Oh, certainly. We have, by the time we invest $1.6 million just to get our crop ready on the trees. That is spread out locally in our community.
Thank you. And final question, and I know I'm short on time. Mr. Colbert, after your experience of working in the fields, what would they have to pay you to do that as a career day in and day out, 365 days of the year?
Whatever the SAG minimum wage is.
Thank you. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. We turn now to the ranking member, Mr. King, for his 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. As I listened to the testimony here, I've accumulated a whole list of things that need to be rebutted, and not the least of which is the minimum wage position. It's pretty interesting to me to hear the testimony of Mr. Glaze that he pays his workers $93 a day for 9 hours work. That works out to be $10.33 an hour. And to hear Ms. Sanchez say that there are not laws that apply to ag workers, and it's true to some degree, and we need to just increase the minimum wage so that we can increase the wages to farm workers and be accused of being, let me say, inconsistent with the rationale. But I think the evidence is right here before us. If Mr. Glaze is paying what he says, and I absolutely believe him, and the minimum wage in the United States is currently $7.25 an hour, there must be a reason Mr. Glaze pays more than the minimum wage, and that's called supply and demand, as I've heard some of the witnesses reference, and I'm sure Dr. Swain would address that within that context. I have said labor is a commodity. I spent a lot of time as labor. I think more time as labor than anybody else on this panel, and it's always been supply and demand. And I've looked at the people that competed against me for those jobs, and I've known that I had to do a better job and show up on time and produce more work per hour, or somebody was going to be looking over my shoulder to take that job. And I started on the pipeline in the construction business with those workers that dug ditch by hand, and if they got tired and couldn't dig, excuse me, and they had to stop and rest on the shovel, somebody was sitting on the dirt pile to come down and take the shovel out of their hand. These were Americans lined up to take jobs. The back of the line piece of this, Mr. Rodriguez's testimony that they would go to the back of the line, and I think it's important that we understand where that line is. If you look at the lines in each of the countries where people have lined up to legally apply to come to America, and I have great respect for those who want to achieve the American dream. But that line is about 50 million long if you add up the accumulated visas out there and the various varieties that we have. And the waiting period of time from Mexico, I don't know that I can speak to that factually, but we know that is several years, and it might be 7 or 8 or 9 years. And it's about that period of time even to bring in a family member from, let's say, a foreign country. So the back of the line, if we're going to talk about the back of the line, it's behind the 50 million. It's not in front of the 50 million. And then I often hear the statement that they would, within the context of the broader version of comprehensive immigration reform, that they would learn English and pay a fine. And the fine started out at $500 and went to $750 and then perhaps $1,500. Learning English is not a penalty. It is a good thing. Wherever in the world you have English, you can go anywhere in the world and get a job. So I'd say that's a benefit to do that. The 72-hour rule, yes, it exists, but think about this subject is not specifically addressed here in this testimony. This subject that we're talking about is the rule of law. And the 72-hour rule says Mr. Lofgrun has 10 seconds to know that a bill is coming up because the rule is waived or ignored or not respected. When we don't respect the rule of law, that's the product that we get. And so I will say the central argument is an essential pillar of American exceptionalism, the rule of law. And we're trying to figure out how to reconcile it after it's been ignored for so long. And I look back at perhaps Dwight Eisenhower was the last president to advance an administration that strictly enforced immigration law. And it's diminished under each administration since that period of time. And we had a good program in the Bracero program. But the '86 Amnesty Act said this will be the last amnesty ever. The last amnesty ever. And I remember Ronald Reagan at least was honest and he said, I'm signing the amnesty bill, but we're going to enforce immigration law. And I believed him. And I still have those records that I kept with the applicants that came in on their I-9 forms. But nobody ever showed up to look at those documents, and the enforcement diminished administration after administration. And now there's been bred a contempt for the rule of law, and we're here with a debate before this panel that seems to argue that we should just simply disregard all the law breaking that's going on because we haven't enforced the law, and now the argument that I've heard is we can't enforce the law. Well, we can, we must. We must reestablish the rule of law. And I don't suggest that we go out and chase people down and round them up and put them in train cars to go back to their home country. I suggest that we enforce the law at the local level with cooperation of local law enforcement officials in the spirit of the 287G program. I suggest that we look to each other, our neighbors, and understand that if there's someone standing on the line, on the clock, being paid, and they're unlawfully working in the United States, then they're taking a job that a legal worker can do, whether they're a legal immigrant or whether they're an illegal immigrant. And this country has an oversupply of underskilled labor. That's why the people that grow up around me that decided they didn't want to go on and get a higher education can no longer punch the clock and make the same money that an educated high school teacher does. It's half the money in my neighborhood. And I would just conclude as I watch the gavel start to move here, rather than ask a question, I'll just make this point. I watched Mr. Colbert. I did finally watch you. I saw the video. I watched you picking beans, and I believe you did. And I also watched you, you said packing corn, but I was watching you unpack corn. And I know you don't do that out there on the cornfield. It gets packed into the crate and gets shipped out here. So I'm just going to presume they ran the film backwards. You were making productive work. And I'd conclude my statement, yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Madam Chair, could Mr. Colbert be given a minute or two to respond?
Mr. Chairman, I didn't actually ask a question, and I don't think I disparaged him. I think I actually complimented him.
Well, perhaps Mr. Gonzalez will give the witness a minute of his time. Mr. Gonzalez is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Colbert, do you wish to respond to Mr. King?
I didn't really understand the statement. It's confusing. Were you implying that I was not actually doing the work that I was depicted as doing?
Would the gentleman yield, Mr. Gonzalez? Would the gentleman yield?
Let's suspend all those rules just since we're dealing with Mr. Colbert. He's just trying to respond to some sort of an opening statement or question. Y'all can just talk to each other.
So there's a general yield here.
That would be nice. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez, for yielding. I only made the point that in watching the film on YouTube of the event of you and Chair Lofgrun working there on the farm, that as I watched you handling corn, in Iowa we know corn, and that's what we do.
I know.
And I know that actually there's corn that gets brought into Iowa, sweet corn, in wooden crates like you were working with that are wired together once they're full. And I thought it was curious that on the farm where you harvest the corn, I was watching you actually unload a crate rather than load the crate. So it was curious to me that it looked like the corn was going the wrong direction, and I only presumed they must have run the film backwards. That was my point then, Mr. Colbert. And I'd yield back to the gentleman,
Now been cleared.
Mr. Gonzalez.
Mr. Gonzalez has the time.
Sure, Mrs. Colbert. Which direction was the corn going?
Well, I want to make sure that if I get this answer wrong, I can't be held for perjury. I was packing corn. I was a corn packer. And I packed it, I put it in the trucks, and I iced it down to keep it at 38 degrees so it wouldn't go through the process where the sugar turns into starch. And we got that corn out that day. I was a corn packer. And I know that term is offensive to some people because corn packer is a derogatory term for a gay Iowan. And I hope I didn't offend anybody.
Mr. Gonzalez.
I definitely will reclaim my time at this point. Dr. Swain, because of your background, your studies, your accomplishments, which are incredible, you have an idea about legal principles, and we're up here and we espouse them all the time. Most of us here are lawyers on this particular committee, and you'll hear the rule of law, nation of laws, not man. But there's another one, is that equal justice under the law, and I think we're familiar with that. What you're going to be hearing from my colleagues on the other side, some of which are from the same state of Texas, where I was born and raised, even the same city, is that the only solution for anyone here that doesn't have legal status, that is an illegal, is deportation. Do you agree with that? That one size should fit all? One punishment for all, and that is, you're not here legally, you shall be deported.
It's my understanding that the cases are heard individually by an administrative judge, and that judge has the discretion to look at particular circumstances. I know that there are people that accidentally fall into illegal status, and I think those...
Oh, no. We're talking about a farm worker that came here in violation of our laws to pick our fruits and vegetables. It wasn't a mistake.
I think that if a person came here deliberately breaking the law, and they get caught, they should expect to bear the punishment, and if the judge says that punishment is deportation...
No, the judge really doesn't... I'm just going to tell you from my experience, because I come from a city that has many, many immigration cases. I've been told that if you came here illegally, misrepresenting your status, came here in any way, you are barred from remaining in this country. So let's just assume I'm right and that a judge has no discretion. Do you believe that that judge should have any other discretion other than deportation?
I think that we should enforce the laws on the book, or we should change them if we're uncomfortable with enforcing them.
I agree with you. And that's what we're trying to do with comprehensive immigration reform. That would stay true to our principle of equal justice under the law. Sometimes the laws don't work anymore. They're not applicable. They don't serve a social or human purpose. That's what we're trying to address. But if you are of like mind with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, then let me ask you this.
Could I say something?
Let me just finish, because Mr. Colbert and Mr. King used most of my time.
I'm sorry.
If you have a death penalty, which what I call the death penalty, and that's the ultimate punishment, and that is you're here illegally, you get deported. But there's two parties to this action. Why don't we close the business that is employing these individuals? We slap them on the wrist, we give them a small fine, place them on some sort of probation, but truly, if you treat the employee in the absolute, why wouldn't you do that to the employer? Why do we have a range of punishment for the employer, but we don't have a range of punishment for the employee? Because you telling me who is being exploited and who's being victimized in a lot of instances in this country, which you seem to agree on that principle, that wages are somehow depressed, working conditions can be deplorable, and until they improve, we're not going to have a domestic labor market.
The gentleman's time has expired.
If it were up to me, I would throw the employers in jail. I think that they do get slapped on the wrist and that they're part of the problem and that that has to be addressed. And the problem that I have with the way that Democrats seem to be defining comprehensive immigration reform is that it seems to be, it doesn't include what I would consider comprehensive, that you would look at all the different aspects of what feeds illegal immigration. It just seems to be about amnesty. To me, comprehensive means you...
The gentleman's time has expired, and I would turn now to...
Madam Chair, and
yes.
I appreciate it, but that word of amnesty, especially coming from Dr. Swain, she knows better than using the word amnesty, but she is clear that she wants to put the employers in jail, and I appreciate
the gentleman's time has expired. We turn now to the gentlelady from California, Congresswoman Chu.
Well, Ranking Member Smith questioned Mr. Colbert's expertise as a witness. However, I would like to point out that in the past, Republicans have had witnesses such as Loretta Swit, who played Hot Lips Houlihan from MASH, to testify on Crush videos, and that Republicans invited Clint Eastwood to testify before Congress about ADA lawsuits, and Republicans also invited Elmo to talk about music education at the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services. Well, on another note, Mr. Colbert, thank you for attending this hearing and highlighting the plight of farm workers. The situation is indeed dire, and I know from my state of California, I heard about the case of Mr. Asuncion Valdivia, who came from Mexico for a better life and took a job that few Americans wanted to do. Every day in the hot summer months, he picked grapes for 10 hours straight in 105-degree temperatures, and then one day he fell ill. He fell ill and could not stand up, and Gia Maria Vineyards, rather than calling the ambulance, told his son to drive Mr. Asuncion home. On the way home, Mr. Asuncion died of a heat stroke, and his son had to watch his father die of a preventable heat stroke at the age of 53. And in fact, this is only one of many stories like this. There have been 23 reported deaths since 2001, and those are only the reported deaths. But this was the last straw, and that's why I worked with Mr. Rodriguez and UFW in carrying legislation to require water, shade, and rest periods on every farm so that outdoor workers could be protected. So I'm wondering, Mr. Colbert, did any of the farm workers that you picked with talk about working conditions having to do with heat, with water, shade, rest periods, any of those kinds of things?
Now, we didn't talk, thank you very much for asking me the question, first of all, but no, we didn't really talk that much. I tried to engage them in conversation, but I don't speak Spanish very well, and they seemed very busy with the beans and with the corn. And I tried to get them to sing field songs and that sort of thing, and they didn't seem to have any. And so I never really found out about what their working conditions were like in terms of what medical was applied, what medical services were available to them, or what health care was available to them, or what kind of breaks were available to them. They seemed to be working the entire time.
Did you experience any of these issues pertaining to heat?
It was very hot. That's what's a yes. It was hotter than I like to be.
And considering the conditions, why would any American worker want to work on jobs like this?
I don't know if Americans would or would not want to work on jobs like this. I believe that Americans are tough. I agree with the congressman that Americans are tough and they do tough jobs. It's not a job I want to do, and not a lot of people took Mr. Rodriguez up on his offer. And it seems from the statistics that my researchers found that there is a lack of labor in parts of the United States, and that seems to say that Americans don't want to take these jobs, but I don't want to say definitively that they won't.
Mr. Colbert, you could work on so many issues. Why are you interested in this issue?
I like talking about people who don't have any power. And this seems like one of the least powerful people in the United States are migrant workers who come and do our work, but don't have any rights as a result. And yet we still invite them to come here, and at the same time ask them to leave. And that's an interesting contradiction to me. And you know, whatsoever you do for the least of my brothers, and these seem like the least of our brothers right now. A lot of people are least brothers right now because the economy is so hard, and I don't want to take anyone's hardship away from them or diminish anything like that. But migrant workers suffer and have no rights.
Well, thank you for that. And in response to Ms. Swain, I would say that according to the most recent data, in 2007, 8.8 million Californians worked for minimum wage, many of them in undesirable jobs. According to your analysis, if we only paid Americans more, they would be willing to work in the fields. But 8.8 million are already taking that lower paycheck. We still don't see Americans flocking to work in the fields, and that, I think, says a lot. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I think this has been a very helpful hearing. You know, as I have listened to my colleagues, I've heard really a plea that we upgrade the conditions of migrant farm workers. And I've been thinking, as I was listening to Ms. Sanchez, that I might introduce a bill that provides for the rights of farm workers to organize as a labor union under national law. We have that in California. That we would make sure that farm workers, migrant farm workers, are covered by workers' compensation, the minimum wage laws, that they also are covered by the overtime laws. And I'm hoping that when I do, that those who've spoken so passionately about the need to upgrade conditions for farm workers will be among the first to ask to co-sponsor that bill. And I will be working with Ms. Sanchez to do that. You know, we, in my career prior to being in Congress, I actually was an immigration lawyer at one time, and I taught immigration law part-time. And I'm very mindful that the laws are important, but the Congress makes the laws. And currently, we have, for those individuals who wish to immigrate to the United States who do not have a college degree, we allocate 5,000 visas a year. So it is, when people say you ought to do it the legal way, I think those individuals probably don't know that there's only 5,000 visas a year, and we've got 2 million farm workers. Now, I do think it's important that we make available first all jobs to the people who are here, but as the campaign of the farm workers has shown, there are some jobs that are not a good fit for people who are unemployed, and part of the problem here is that these are seasonal migrant jobs. And I was very pleased to go to New York and look with Mr. Colbert at the farm there, but I'm mindful of my trip earlier this year to the strawberry farm outside of my district, where luckily the farm workers are represented by the United Farm Workers. Those migrant farm workers earn $18,000 to $19,000 a year. They have health care benefits. They have a pension plan. They are provided housing, and in talking to their employer, they have been unable to get Americans to come take these jobs because they are killer jobs. I mean, it is, I was out there picking those strawberries, and that's just the fact. We could say that's a good idea or a bad idea. That's the reality. And reading Mr. Glaze's testimony and understanding in California the number of farms that have simply folded and gone off farm, this has implications for the entire American workforce, upstream, downstream. We've got 3 to 4 jobs that Americans are doing for every migrant farm worker who's here. And so if those farms close and go offshore, it's not just the farm workers who are displaced, it's the 4 Americans who are dependent on those farm workers who are displaced. So this is a very serious issue. I would just like to thank each one of our witnesses for being here. A lot of people don't realize that the witnesses who come before Congress are volunteers. They come, I mean, just as volunteers to help make a better country, to help the Congress understand an issue better. And so each one of you, as a volunteer, has done that today. I thank you for doing so. I thank the members for their participation. I would note that the record will remain open for 5 legislative days so that members may submit material, and further that members may have additional questions for the witnesses that will also be submitted within 5 days, and if that should occur, we would request respectfully that the response be forthcoming. With that, I would thank all of the witnesses and members for their participation and would adjourn this committee.
Thank you for backing the card, Stephen. Griff Jenkins would like Stevens. Can I just give you a card?
Thank you. I enjoyed doing this with you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Lovely to meet you. Thank you very much. Stephen.
Nice to meet you.
I'd love to talk to you.
Well, it's just been we provide
Thanks very much. Hold on, let me just grab my stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, you'll see in the back.
Are you glad you came? Another phone?
Yeah, I learned what.
Worried about trivializing such a serious issue?
What did you think of your experience?